October 21st, 1995, New Orleans. A tour bus sits outside the House of Blues, engine silent in the humid Louisiana air. Inside, Shannon Hoon lies unconscious on a narrow bunk, the man who just 2 years ago gave the world No Rain, the song that made millions smile, now drowning in his own personal storm. He'd once written, "I'm not a rock star. I'm just a guy trying not to drown in his own head." The irony is devastating. The man who sang about finding joy in rain puddles was dying from the rain inside himself. No Rain made millions feel less alone, but its creator died in the deepest loneliness of all. By morning, news will break across MTV, radio stations, record stores. The voice that taught a generation to dance in the rain had been silenced by the very storm he'd been running from his entire life. The official cause? Acute cocaine intoxication. The real cause? A world that wanted his sunshine but never cared about his darkness. Was this really an overdose? Or the inevitable end of a soul too sensitive for the machine that consumed him? What if Shannon Hoon didn't die from cocaine but from carrying everyone else's happiness while drowning in his own sorrow? But to understand how the boy who sang about rain became the man who drowned in it, we must go back to where it all began. To Indiana, where a child learned that feeling everything was both gift and curse. Lafayette, Indiana, September 26, 1967. Richard Shannon Hoon entered the world screaming, a sound that would define his life, though it would later be refined into something that could heal hearts and break them simultaneously. Born to Richard and Nell Hoon in blue-collar America, Shannon seemed destined for ordinary Midwest life. But from the beginning, Shannon was different. Too sensitive, his mother would say, not as criticism, but as worried observation. The boy who cried at sunsets and heard music and wind through cornfields, who felt other people's emotions as if they were his own physical pain. While other children played with toys, Shannon collected sounds, storing melodies that existed only in his hypersensitive imagination. His father worked construction, honest labor that built character and calluses. His mother cleaned other people's houses, her hands growing rough from scrubbing away strangers' dirt. Good people, salt of the earth stock, but they couldn't understand their youngest son's strange intensity, the way he seemed to absorb the world's pain through his pores. School was torture for a boy who felt everything at maximum volume. Teachers called him disruptive when he couldn't sit still, couldn't focus on lessons while emotional chaos thundered in his head. Classmates saw him as weird, the kid who wrote poetry during math class, who cried at movies, who heard symphonies in everyday sounds that were just noise to everyone else. Shannon tried to fit the expected molds. He played football, was decent at it, understood that toughness was currency in small-town Indiana. But beneath the pads and helmet was a poet's heart, too tender for the brutal mathematics of teenage masculinity. He learned early to hide his sensitivity, to perform normalcy while his real self remained underground. Music became his sanctuary and his translation device. When Shannon discovered his voice in middle school choir, something extraordinary happened. Not just sound, but pure emotion made audible. His voice was different from anything his classmates produced, raw, vulnerable, capable of expressing joy and heartbreak in the same breath. That voice became his only honest language. When the world felt too loud, too harsh, too demanding, Shannon could retreat into song. He could take the chaos in his head and transform it into harmony, could make his hypersensitivity serve beauty instead of just causing pain. Music wasn't hobby. It was survival mechanism, the only way to process feelings too big for words alone. High school brought both revelation and deeper isolation. Shannon could make people feel something through his voice, but making people feel made him a target. Sensitive boys weren't popular in Reagan's America. Boys who wrote poetry were suspect. Boys who cried at beauty were considered broken. But Shannon found his tribe among the misfits and artists, kids who didn't fit standard categories. They gathered in basements and garages, making music that sounded nothing like MTV. Shannon's voice cut through amateur noise like divine intervention, impossible to ignore, impossible to forget, impossible to categorize. During these years, Shannon developed two friendships that would shape his trajectory. First was Bill Bailey, a guitarist who understood Shannon's musical vision and could translate emotional chaos into sonic architecture. Second was more complicated, a pen-pal relationship with W. Axl Rose, another sensitive misfit who'd escaped to Los Angeles. When Guns N' Roses started conquering the world, Axl remembered his talented friend from Indiana. In 1990, Shannon contributed backing vocals to Don't Cry, his ethereal harmonies adding haunting beauty to Axl's aggressive wail. It was Shannon's first taste of big-time recording, his first glimpse of what success might look like. But success, Shannon was about to discover, was more dangerous than failure. Being good at music was different from being good at being famous. Having a beautiful voice was different from having a personality that could survive the spotlight. Creating art was different from becoming product. Could his early experiences have laid the foundation for later triumphs and tragedies? Did growing up different in a place that demanded conformity teach Shannon that authenticity came at unbearable prices? Was his hypersensitivity, the quality that made his voice transcendent, also the flaw that would eventually destroy him? When he left Indiana for Los Angeles in 1991, was he chasing dreams or running from a self he could never escape? Los Angeles, 1991. Shannon Hoon arrived in the City of Angels carrying nothing but songs and dangerous levels of hope. 24 years old enough to know better, young enough to believe that talent alone could survive in the music industry's most ruthless ecosystem. The city hit him like sensory overload. After Indiana's honest simplicity, Los Angeles felt like performance art. Too bright, too fast, everyone acting roles in movies that existed only in their heads. Everyone was almost famous, almost discovered, almost ready for breakthrough that would justify years of sacrifice. Shannon found housing in a decrepit apartment complex where aspiring artists pooled resources and shared misery. His neighbors were painters and poets and actors, all talented, all struggling, all learning that artistic vision was just the entry fee for a game with rules nobody explained until after you'd already lost everything. Money was scarce. Shannon worked dead-end jobs, record store clerk, coffee shop server, anything that paid rent while leaving energy for music. But real work happened at night, in rehearsal spaces and dive bars where musicians could make noise loud enough to drown out crushing self-doubt. It was during one late-night session that Shannon met the musicians who would become Blind Melon. Roger Stevens and Christopher Thorne on guitars, Glenn Graham on drums, Brad Smith on bass. Four guys who shared Shannon's belief that music should mean something, should feel dangerous, should refuse to be elevator music for ordinary lives. The chemistry was immediate and electric. Shannon's voice was ethereal and vulnerable. The band provided earthbound weight. His lyrics touched spiritual searching and emotional chaos. Their instruments created sonic landscapes that could contain his intensity without being consumed by it. Together they sounded like nothing else, too weird for pop, too melodic for grunge, too honest for commercial radio. They called themselves Blind Melon, after a Cheech and Chong character, though the name seemed to carry deeper meaning. Something about seeing clearly through blindness, finding sweetness in unexpected places, the strange beauty of being lost and discovering that lostness could be its own destination. Early years were marked by relentless rehearsal and sporadic gigs at Los Angeles clubs specializing in showcasing unknown bands to audiences of other unknown musicians. Shannon treated every show, whether for 5 people or 50 as Madison Square Garden. His stage presence was hypnotic, vulnerable yet commanding, fragile yet powerful, as if channeling emotions too big for his physical body to contain. But even then, warning signs were visible. Shannon's sensitivity made his voice compelling but made ordinary life extraordinarily difficult. He felt criticism like physical wounds, praise like drugs, ordinary setbacks like existential catastrophes. He began using alcohol and marijuana to dull the sharp edges, to create buffer zones between his exposed nerves and Los Angeles' brutal indifference. Band members watched with mixture of concern and helplessness as Shannon developed coping mechanisms that worked short-term but worried them long-term. But Shannon was the voice, the irreplaceable element that made Blind Melon more than garage band. They needed him functional, so they enabled behaviors that kept him functional, even when those behaviors felt dangerous. Recording demos became obsession. Shannon would spend hours perfecting vocal takes, searching for exact emotional truth each song demanded. He had vision of what the band could become, not just musicians but emotional archaeologists, digging up feelings buried under layers of social convention and cultural numbness. He wanted their music to remind people what it felt like to be fully alive. The breakthrough came when their demo reached Capitol Records' Gary Gersh, who'd previously signed Nirvana and understood that music was ready for voices speaking emotional truth without apology. Gersh heard necessity in Shannon's voice, not just talent, but the sound of someone who needed to sing like others needed to breathe. The record deal in 1991 felt like validation of everything Shannon had sacrificed. Finally, someone with power believed in their vision. Finally, they'd reach beyond club audiences to listeners who might understand what they were communicating. Finally, Shannon's voice would have platform worthy of its message. But success came with prices nobody mentioned in contracts. Fame meant surrendering privacy. Recognition meant accepting scrutiny. Having art heard by millions meant losing control over interpretation, commodification, consumption. The boy who'd used music to escape the world was about to learn that success meant the world would never let him escape again. Was the success they achieved truly worth all the pain they endured? When Shannon signed that record deal, did he understand he was trading anonymity for visibility? Solitude for scrutiny? Could anyone have warned him that getting everything you want can be the most dangerous thing that can happen to a heart too open for its own protection? 1992 brought recording of Blind Melon's debut album, process that should have been creative heaven, but became Shannon's education in the gap between artistic vision and commercial reality. Capitol Records studios represented everything Shannon had dreamed of, but recording was as much business as art. Shannon approached sessions with characteristic intensity, treating each vocal take as potential confession, each song as opportunity to translate untranslatable human chaos into something others might recognize in themselves. He would spend hours perfecting deliveries, never satisfied unless performance felt like pure vulnerability made audible. The album that emerged was unlike anything in 1992's musical landscape. While grunge dominated with anger and alienation, Blind Melon offered something different. Hope wrapped in melancholy, joy tinged with sadness, complex emotional honesty from someone who felt everything at volume 11. Shannon's voice danced between falsetto vulnerability and full-throated passion, creating sonic spaces where listeners could recognize their own complicated feelings. Songs like Tones of Home and Soak the Sin showcased Shannon's range, not just vocally but emotionally. He could sound like choir boy and blues shouter in same song, could convey innocence and experience simultaneously. His lyrics avoided grunge's fashionable nihilism, offering spiritual searching and emotional honesty that felt both personal and universal. But one song would change everything. though nobody predicted its impact during recording. No Rain began as Shannon's attempt to capture specific feeling, experience of being outsider who finds joy in simple things, who dances to internal music others can't hear. Lyrics were autobiographical without being confessional, specific enough to feel real, universal enough for anyone to claim. All I can say is that my life is pretty plain, Shannon sang, voice carrying resignation and acceptance simultaneously. I like watching the puddles gather rain. The song wasn't about depression exactly, but about finding beauty in ordinary moments, choosing joy despite loneliness, strange comfort of being different in world demanding conformity. The band's arrangement was perfect, loose enough to breathe, tight enough to propel, creating musical space where Shannon's voice could float and soar. Melody was deceptively simple, seeming effortless but representing countless hours of refinement. It sounded like sunlight, like childhood summers, like hope itself made audible. Album's release in September 1992 brought positive critics but modest commercial success. Music journalists appreciated Blind Melon's refusal to fit categories, praised Shannon's distinctive voice and emotionally honest songwriting. But radio programmers weren't sure how to categorize them, and without clear genre classification, albums struggled to find audience. Shannon watched nervously as sales remained disappointingly low, as radio stations passed on singles, as industry machinery seemed confused by what they'd created. Self-doubt crept in. Maybe they were too weird, too different, too unwilling to conform to market demands. Maybe authenticity wasn't enough. Maybe feeling everything so intensely was artistic liability rather than asset. Then came the call that changed everything. MTV wanted No Rain in heavy rotation, but they needed video. Not just any video, something capturing the song's spirit of joyful outsiderness, translating Shannon's emotional honesty into visual terms that could reach television audiences. The concept was perfect in its simplicity. A young girl in bee costume, the bee girl, would wander through a world of ordinary people who didn't understand her, searching for a place where she belonged. Video would end with her finding that place. Field full of other bee costume dancers, community of outsiders celebrating their difference. Shannon understood immediately why it worked. The bee girl was him. Was everyone who'd ever felt too different, too sensitive, too strange for their assigned world. Video was about finding your tribe, discovering that being weird was only lonely until you found other weird people. Possibility that outsiderness could transform from curse into blessing. Video shoot was magical. Heather DeLoach, 12-year-old actress playing B-Girl, brought exactly right combination of melancholy and hope. Her dance at video's end, awkward, joyful, completely unself-conscious, became instant iconic image, visual representation of what Shannon had been trying to communicate through music. When MTV started heavy rotation in spring 1993, response was immediate and overwhelming. B-Girl became cultural phenomenon, her image appearing on T-shirts and posters, her dance copied by teenagers across America. More importantly for Blind Melon, video drove No Rain up charts, transforming them from cult band into mainstream success. But success was more complicated than Shannon had imagined. The sensitivity that made his voice compelling also made fame extraordinarily difficult. Suddenly, everyone wanted pieces of him. Journalists wanting interviews, fans wanting autographs, executives wanting follow-up hits. The quiet kid from Indiana who'd used music to escape attention found himself center of attention he couldn't escape. Behind all that glamour was their already unbearable loneliness that nobody saw. When Shannon watched No Rain climb charts, when B-Girl danced on every MTV screen, when strangers sang his words back at him, did it feel like triumph or like losing himself? The success was everything he dreamed of. It was also beginning of nightmare that would consume him. By summer 1993, No Rain had become more than hit. It was cultural phenomenon, soundtrack to Generation X's complicated relationship with hope and alienation. MTV played video constantly. Radio stations had song in heavy rotation. B-Girl's awkward, joyful dance became shorthand for finding belonging among outsiders. Shannon watched this success with mixture of elation and terror. Millions were connecting with something he'd created, finding comfort in his words and voice. Song was reaching exactly the audience he'd hoped for. Sensitive souls who felt different, who struggled to fit, who needed reminder that being weird could be wonderful. But success came with costs nobody warned him about. Privacy disappeared overnight. Shannon couldn't buy groceries without being recognized, couldn't eat without fans approaching, couldn't exist publicly without performing some version of person people expected him to be. The quiet introspection that had always been his refuge became impossible to find. Industry machinery kicked into overdrive, demanding more of everything that made No Rain successful. Label executives wanted another B-themed video. Radio programmers wanted more songs exactly like the hit. Journalists wanted Shannon to explain and re-explain meaning behind lyrics he'd written as personal confession, not public statement. Touring became relentless. Blind Melon went from small clubs to headlining theaters to opening for Neil Young and Pearl Jam. Every night, thousands of strangers sang Shannon's most personal lyrics back at him, transforming private pain into public celebration. Experience was simultaneously thrilling and alienating. Art was reaching people, but reaching them meant exposing himself in ways that felt unsustainable. Shannon's stage presence was mesmerizing and troubling. He performed with total emotional commitment, treating each show as confession booth where he could pour out everything he felt but couldn't say in conversation. Audiences were transfixed by intensity, by way he seemed to channel something larger than himself. But band members watched nervously as line between performance and breakdown blurred. Pressure to duplicate No Rain's success affected Shannon's songwriting in complicated ways. Part of him wanted to prove Blind Melon was more than one-hit wonder, that they could create music both commercially successful and artistically honest. But another part resented expectation that all songs should sound like variations on themes that had accidentally found mass appeal. Shannon began experimenting with harder drugs during this period, moving beyond alcohol and marijuana to cocaine and pills, promising temporary escape from overwhelming fame. Drugs seemed helpful initially, dulling anxiety's sharp edges, providing artificial confidence for performances, creating buffer between exposed sensitivity and public attention's harsh glare. But pharmaceutical solutions came with problems. Shannon's natural volatility became amplified by chemical interference. Mood swings grew dramatic. Behavior became unpredictable. Band members found themselves walking on eggshells, never sure which Shannon would appear for rehearsals or sessions. Success also created unexpected personal complications. Hometown friends struggled to relate to someone who'd become famous, treating him with mixture of pride and resentment that made old relationships feel artificial. Family was supportive but couldn't understand pressures he faced. Even romantic relationships became complicated by questions of whether people were attracted to Shannon or his fame. During this chaotic period, Shannon met Lisa Krause, woman who seemed to see past public persona to vulnerable person underneath. Their relationship offered something desperately needed, connection with someone who could love the man rather than image. When Lisa became pregnant in 1994, Shannon briefly felt hopeful that fatherhood might provide anchor to stabilize his turbulent life. But even impending parenthood couldn't slow success machinery consuming Shannon's existence. Blind Melon was expected to follow breakthrough quickly, to prove they were more than novelty-riding viral videos' coattails. Band entered studios to record second album while Shannon struggled to process what success had done to his life, relationships, sense of self. Sessions for what became Soup were marked by Shannon's increasing drug reliance to manage competing pressures of creativity and commerce. He wanted music that was honest and adventurous, that pushed sound in new directions, but he felt pressure to create something satisfying fans wanting more. No rain. Radio programmers needing familiar sounds, executives expecting commercial success. Did this period of overwhelming success mark the beginning of his downfall? Or was it revealing problems that had always existed? Was fame the cause of Shannon's increasing drug use, or just context where underlying fragility became visible? Could anyone handle sudden transition from obscurity to celebrity without losing pieces of themselves? The boy who'd found sanctuary in music discovered success had turned refuge into prison, gift into burden, voice into commodity, belonging more to world than to himself. 1994 brought both pinnacle of Shannon's career and beginning of his most visible struggles. Year started with Blind Melon riding sustained success of No Rain, their faces on magazine covers, videos in heavy rotation, concerts selling out across America and Europe. But Shannon was drowning in plain sight. The sensitive kid from Indiana who'd used music to process overwhelming emotions found himself trapped in spotlight that made private reflection impossible. Every feeling became public property, every struggle became tabloid material, every moment of vulnerability became performance, whether intended or not. Pressure was most visible during live performances. Shannon had always been an intense performer, channeling raw emotion into stage presence. But intensity was now amplified by chemical enhancement and psychological pressure. He would prowl stages like caged animal, movements erratic, behavior unpredictable. Audiences were riveted by performances that felt like watching nervous breakdowns in real time. Woodstock '94 became a defining moment of this period, triumph and tragedy compressed into single performance. Festival was supposed to celebrate original Woodstock's 25th anniversary, bringing together biggest names in alternative rock for 3 days of music and nostalgia. For Blind Melon, it was chance to prove they belonged among era's most important bands. Shannon's preparation revealed extent of his psychological fragmentation. Unable to decide what to wear for such significant performance, he ultimately chose to perform in yellow sundress, complete with flowers in his hair. Image was striking. Part protest against masculine expectations, part artistic statement, part cry for help disguised as creative choice. Performance itself was mesmerizing and disturbing. Shannon sang No Rain with desperate intensity, as if trying to convince himself of song's hopeful message, while visibly struggling with internal storm. His voice was powerful but strained, movements graceful but manic. Hundreds of thousands witnessed peak artistic achievement and personal crisis simultaneously. Video footage shows Shannon looking ethereal and haunted, beautiful and broken. In yellow dress, flowers wilting in hair, he resembled damaged angel, too sensitive for world he inhabited, too gifted to escape spotlight slowly destroying him. Performance became iconic, but for wrong reasons, memorable not just for artistry but for evidence of young man coming apart. Birth of Shannon's daughter, Nico Blue, in July 1994, should have provided stabilizing force. Becoming father was something Shannon wanted deeply, believing unconditional love might provide anchor needed to control increasingly destructive behavior. But even this joy was complicated by inability to be consistently present, physically or emotionally. Shannon adored Nico but struggled with parenting responsibilities. Touring schedule made consistent presence impossible. Drug use made him unreliable when present. Lisa found herself essentially single parenting while Shannon battled demons that seemed to strengthen rather than weaken with time. Man who could sing about hope for millions couldn't provide stability for own family. Shannon's songwriting during this period reflected internal turmoil. Songs like Galaxy and Toes Across the Floor showed artistic growth but revealed psychological deterioration. Lyrics became more abstract, more desperate, filled with references to drowning and disappearing and searching for escape from unnameable pain. Joy that characterized No Rain was replaced by something darker, more complex, more honest about cost of feeling everything at maximum intensity. Recording sessions for Soup became exercises in managing Shannon's unpredictability. He would arrive in various states of intoxication, creative input brilliant but erratic. Band members learned to work around moods, capturing contributions when functional, covering when he wasn't. Album that emerged was artistically adventurous but commercially challenging. Too strange for pop radio, too melodic for alternative rock, too sad for audience that had fallen in love with B-Girl's joyful dance. Jelly Soup was released in August 1995 to critical acclaim but disappointing sales. Journalists praised band's willingness to evolve, Shannon's continued vocal growth, album's emotional honesty. But without obvious single like No Rain, radio programmers passed on most tracks. Album peaked at number 28, successful by most standards, devastating compared to debut's commercial performance. Shannon took relative failure personally, seeing it as evidence that authentic artistic expression was incompatible with mass appeal. Drugs that had once helped cope with success now became necessary to manage failure. He began using cocaine daily, not for performance enhancement but for basic emotional survival. Did this tragic period mark his downfall, or reveal deeper problems that had always existed? Was Shannon's increasing drug use reaction to specific fame pressures, or inevitable result of sensitivity making ordinary life unbearable? Could anyone have saved him from trajectory that seemed written in DNA? Or were same qualities making his voice extraordinary also guarantee of destruction? The man who'd sung about rain gathering in puddles was now drowning in storms of his own making, unable to find shelter from feelings too big for any human heart to contain. The final tour began in September 1995 with Shannon in worst physical and psychological condition of his life. 3 years of intensive drug use had taken visible toll. Weight loss, gray pallor of someone whose body was fighting losing battle against chemical assault. Once bright eyes now carrying permanent exhaustion no sleep could cure. But he was determined to support Soup, to prove Blind Melon was more than one-hit wonder, to demonstrate that artistic evolution deserved attention even if it didn't fit commercial radio formats. Band had invested too much time, energy, money creating second album to let it disappear without proper promotion. Early shows revealed both Shannon's continued vocal power and increasing instability. He could still deliver transcendent performances, still channel raw emotion into musical expression, leaving audiences breathless. But offstage, he was barely functional, requiring constant management from band members and crew who'd become caretakers for someone spiraling beyond control. Shannon's behavior was heartbreaking to witness. Hours before shows were consumed by anxiety, using cocaine to calm nerves already frayed beyond repair. He would perform with manic intensity bordering on self-destruction, pouring everything into 45-minute sets that left him completely drained. Then he would disappear immediately, seeking chemical refuge from emotional vulnerability that performance required. Drugs had stopped being recreational months ago. Now they were essential for Shannon to function at all. Cocaine for energy, alcohol for anxiety, pills for physical pain from constantly abusing his body. Classic addiction cycle, using drugs to manage problems created by drug use, requiring increasingly larger amounts for diminishing effects. Band members watched helplessly as Shannon deteriorated before their eyes. They'd tried interventions, pleaded with him to enter rehabilitation, threatened to cancel tour unless he got help. But Shannon was trapped, too dependent to function, too ashamed to admit need for help, too afraid of sobriety to imagine life without chemical buffer between himself and overwhelming world. His journals from this period reveal psychological pain's depth. "I'm scared of being alone," he wrote, "because that's when the demons get loud." In another entry, "The rain never stops, it only falls inside me." Most heartbreaking was unsent letter to Lisa. "I'm trying, but the rain inside me won't stop. I don't know how to make it stop." By October, Shannon's condition was impossible to ignore. Weight had dropped dangerously. Hands shook when not using. Speech was often slurred even when claiming sobriety. Man who'd embodied youthful joy looked decades older than 28 years. Final shows took place in New Orleans, city whose reputation for debauchery made it particularly dangerous for someone in Shannon's condition. Venue was House of Blues, intimate setting that should have been perfect for showcasing Soup's artistic growth. Instead, it became stage for Shannon's final performances. October 20th was typical of late career performances, brilliant and terrifying simultaneously. Shannon sang with power seeming to come from beyond his physical body, but between song banter was rambling and incoherent. He dedicated songs to absent people, told stories making no logical sense, displayed behavior worrying even audience members who didn't know him. After the show, Shannon disappeared immediately, refusing to join band for post-concert meal. He was found hours later in tour bus, passed out with cocaine residue visible on surfaces around him. Band discussed canceling final show, but Shannon woke claiming to feel better, promising to make final performance special. Can anyone ever truly escape shadow of their darkest moments? Looking at Shannon during those final days, seeing him struggle against forces consuming his life, was there any possibility of redemption? Could love have saved him? From Lisa, from Nico, from band members who'd become family? Or had addiction created prison that could only be escaped through death? October 21st, 1995, House of Blues, New Orleans. Shannon's final performance was both ending and prophecy. Last confession from someone who'd spent entire career pouring his heart onto stages for strangers who sang his pain back at him. He opened with Galaxy, voice carrying power and fragility as he sang about wanting to disappear, finding peace in dissolution. Song had always been emotionally challenging, but that night felt like autobiography, real-time documentation of someone preparing to let go. Between songs, Shannon spoke to audience with unusual directness. "Music is the only way I can breathe," he said, words that would seem prophetic. "When the music stops, I stop." He talked about his daughter, about wanting to be better than he was, about hoping somewhere in darkness there was still light worth reaching toward. Final song was No Rain, track that made him famous and trapped him. As he sang opening lines, "All I can say is that my life is pretty plain." Voice carried new weight, informed by years teaching him difference between simplicity he'd celebrated and complexity that nearly destroyed him. Performance ended with Shannon alone on stage, arms outstretched, head tilted back, offering himself to something larger than audience, larger than music, larger than pain defining his adult life. Applause was thunderous, but Shannon seemed to hear something else. Perhaps silence, perhaps peace, perhaps sound of rain finally stopping. After show, Shannon retreated immediately to tour bus. Band members were accustomed to post-performance disappearances and didn't think to check until morning. By then, it was too late. Security footage shows Shannon entering bus alone around 11:30 p.m. carrying small bag likely containing final drug purchase. Bus remained dark and silent for hours. No movement visible, no sounds indicating distress. Shannon died quietly alone, probably within hours of performance that had been his last confession. Official cause was acute cocaine intoxication. clinical language reducing complex tragedy to simple medical fact. But those who knew Shannon understood cocaine was method, not cause. Real cause was more complicated. Sensitivity too pure for harsh world, talent too honest for commercial industry, heart too open for protection needed to survive. Body was discovered by Brad Smith, who'd come to check before scheduled departure. Smith's scream brought other band members, but there was nothing to be done. Shannon lay on narrow bunk, peaceful in death in ways he'd rarely been in life, finally free from demons tormenting him since childhood. News spread quickly through music industry and beyond. MTV interrupted programming to announce loss of alternative rock's most distinctive voices. Radio stations played No Rain in tribute, creating strange circumstance where Shannon's song about finding joy was being used to mourn his death. Irony was devastating. Millions who'd never met Shannon felt genuine grief, having connected with something essential in his voice, finding comfort in songs expressing feelings they couldn't articulate. Man who died feeling alone and misunderstood was mourned by countless strangers who felt they'd lost someone who understood them. Were these final decisions acts of surrender, or inevitable consequences of lifestyle spiraled beyond control? Could Shannon have been saved with more aggressive intervention, or had he reached point where salvation was impossible? Was his death preventable tragedy or logical conclusion of sensitivity making ordinary life unbearable? The funeral took place in Lafayette, Indiana, Shannon's hometown, where he was buried in soil that nurtured earliest dreams and witnessed initial artistic awakening. Service was small, attended by family, friends, band members struggling to process loss of someone who'd been both brother and burden, genius and cautionary tale. Lisa attended with 2-year-old Nico, too young to understand, but who would grow up knowing father only through recordings and stories. Videos capturing voice but not presence. Shannon's parents buried youngest son while trying to understand how someone capable of bringing joy to millions had been unable to find peace for himself. Was his death as straightforward as reported, or were deeper forces at work? Medical examiner's conclusion was clear. Acute cocaine intoxication, accidental overdose, death by misadventure. But real story was more complex, involving industry commodifying sensitivity, culture rewarding performance over authenticity, individual whose greatest strength became fatal weakness. Shannon died during alternative rock's cultural dominance, when sensitive male voices were celebrated as antidotes to corporate pop and aggressive metal. Kurt Cobain had died 18 months earlier under different but related circumstances, also a victim of sensitivity feeling unbearable in fame's spotlight. Pattern suggested something systemic about how industry handled artistic vulnerability. But Shannon's death was unique in particular cruelty. Unlike Cobain, who'd written extensively about pain and alienation, Shannon had become famous for song about hope and joy. No Rain continued making people happy long after creator died in despair, creating permanent irony haunting everyone who knew man behind music. In months following death, tributes poured from across industry. Fellow musicians spoke about Shannon's influence, his willingness to be vulnerable in ways giving others permission to express emotional truth. Critics wrote about distinctive voice, refusal to conform to genre expectations, role in expanding what alternative rock could be. Most meaningful tributes came from ordinary fans who wrote letters to magazines, posted messages on early internet forums, created homemade memorials at record stores. These fans understood something essential about Shannon's appeal. He'd made them feel less alone, given voice to feelings they couldn't express, created musical spaces where sensitivity was strength rather than weakness. Band members faced impossible decision of continuing without voice defining their sound. They attempted reunions with other singers, released compilations, tried honoring Shannon's memory while creating new music. But nothing could replace what was lost. Not just voice, but vision. Particular combination of vulnerability and power making Shannon irreplaceable. Nico Blue grew up surrounded by father's legacy but burdened by absence. She would describe complex relationship with music bringing father fame but unable to save him, with recordings preserving voice but not presence. Learning to love barely known father through songs millions of strangers also claimed became lifelong challenge. Discovery of Shannon's personal video archive, more than 200 hours he'd shot during final years, added new dimension to understanding his tragedy. Tapes revealed someone acutely aware of own decline, documenting struggles with addiction, love for family, desperate attempts to find peace in chaos fame created. These videos, eventually compiled into documentary All I Can Say, provided unprecedented insight into artistic mind under pressure. Shannon had essentially created biographical record, filming himself in crisis and clarity, creating archive outliving him, and providing testament to experience's complexity. Footage was beautiful and devastating, showing someone trying to understand himself while being destroyed by uncontrollable forces. Shannon Hoon's legacy remains complicated decades after death. No Rain continues appearing in movies and commercials, message of joyful outsiderness still resonating with new generations identifying with B-Girls' search for belonging. But song's enduring popularity serves as constant reminder of voice silenced too early, talent consumed by machinery designed to amplify it. His influence on subsequent musicians is undeniable. Countless singers cite Shannon's vulnerability as inspiration for their own artistic honesty. His vocal style, moving from whisper to wail within single song, established template for emotional expressiveness continuing to influence alternative rock and indie music. But Shannon's story also serves as cautionary tale about sensitivity's price in industry rewarding performance over authenticity. Death highlighted systemic problems continuing to affect musicians, pressure to maintain public personas incompatible with private struggles, expectation that artistic vulnerability should be commodified for mass consumption, assumption that talent comes with obligation to sacrifice well-being for public entertainment. Shannon's tragedy wasn't just dying young, but dying feeling fundamentally misunderstood despite touching millions through music. He created art, helping others feel less alone while dying of loneliness himself. He sang about finding joy in simple things while unable to find peace in extraordinary success achieved. What hidden secrets might remain untold about pressures he faced, support he needed but didn't receive, moments when different choices might have led to different outcomes. Death certificate lists official cause but real causes, industry indifference to artist well-being, cultural expectation that sensitive men should be strong, social isolation fame can create, remain largely unaddressed. When we listen to No Rain today, when we watch B-Girls' joyful dance, when we remember Shannon as voice of Generation X optimism, we must also remember the cost at which that joy was purchased. We must ask whether we've learned from his death, whether industry has become more supportive of vulnerable artists, whether culture has grown more understanding of sensitivity as strength rather than weakness. Shannon wanted to bring happiness through music. He succeeded beyond wildest dreams, creating songs continuing to comfort and inspire decades after death. But price paid, isolation, addiction, premature death, should haunt us as much as voice continues to heal us. His gravestone in Lafayette bears simple inscription: Richard Shannon Hoon, 1967 to 1995, beloved son, father, friend. No mention of fame, success, or musical achievement. Just acknowledgement of human relationships meaning more than all applause in world. Relationships his sensitivity made precious, but fame made difficult to maintain. The rain Shannon sang about, Rain others found beautiful, representing possibility and renewal, became internal storm, eventually consuming him. But voice remains, preserved in recordings capturing something essential about feeling deeply in world, often rewarding numbness, searching for authenticity in culture built on performance, finding hope despite evidence. Hope might be dangerous luxury for hearts too open for protection. Shannon Hoon died at 28, but voice lives on at eternal 28, forever young, forever searching, forever reminding us that music can be bridge between souls, that vulnerability can be form of courage, that sometimes most beautiful songs come from places of deepest pain. The boy from Indiana who learned music was only way he could breathe, left behind soundtrack for everyone who's ever felt too much, loved too deeply, or danced to music others couldn't hear. The rain inside him finally stopped, but music, that impossible combination of joy and sadness defining his voice, continues to fall like gentle precipitation on anyone willing to listen, to feel, to remember that being different isn't curse but gift. Music can save the listener. But can it ever save the one who creates it? Shannon Hoon didn't die from cocaine. He died because the world only wanted to hear joy from a heart that was breaking. The man who taught millions to dance in the rain drowned in the storm inside himself. His voice lives forever. The silence that followed echoes still. What if we'd listened not just to his songs, but to his silence? What if we'd seen not just the performer, but the person? What if we'd cared not just about the music, but about the man who was drowning while teaching us all to dance? The rain never stops. It only falls inside those brave enough to feel everything. And sometimes that feeling is too much for any one heart to hold.